Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Thursday, January the 23rd meeting of the Camden Planning Board. As usual, I'll start by asking if there's any public comments on non-agenda items. Not seeing any members of the public, we'll skip that one. So let's move on to proposed zoning ordinance amendments. Jeremy.
Okay, thank you. Why don't can we maybe close the hearing that we had continued to today? The only reason I say that is the versions that we're now working with are much different than where we were before. And I know, there was a member here last time from the public. I know he is interested in this, and he was in the office today. And there are changes, and I just for appropriateness, we ought to close that hearing, and then we can just start another.
So we need to make a motion to close it and then a motion to open it. Is that how?
No, just a motion to close that one, and then we'll just start with the discussion item on the issue.
All right. I make a motion to close the public hearing that was begun last week and continue to this week. Do I have a second?
I second that.
All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. 5-0 unanimous.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so let's open a new public hearing.
No, we're not opening a new hearing. We're just having a discussion.
Just having a discussion.
Yes,
Sorry.
and then we'll
Excuses.
get to a hearing once we get a final version, hopefully, that you guys can agree to. We'll start that over, or at least redo it.
Okay.
So accessory apartments we're talking about. If you remember from the last meeting, we had quite a conversation that spiraled all over the place, which is appropriate. And I think it's good to have those discussions. And sometimes when you're doing these ordinances, you don't think of every possible scenario or everything that could happen. So I think it's good that where we got to. Jeannie and I and Steve have spent honestly an inordinate amount of time on this accessory apartment thing over the last week, which is fine. I have since now tweaked versions from what I sent to you earlier this week.
Did we get two different packets here?
So what you have, I think Jeannie put down on your desk in front of you, which is the current where we're coming from.
Today's version that got emailed over.
I have two of each.
One says.
One's redlined.
JM.
That's it? Okay.
And the other is ready for, this first one doesn't, it's got the red.
Gotcha. That's what I was trying to figure out. Yep. Okay.
This is good.
But you'll need to.
Red line or not red line?
Okay.
Yeah. It's
Right.
just ready for hearing, they're calling it.
So,
The red line version.
Sorry, just
So-
go through that again. So the revised JM is the old one, or is it just without the?
Two versions.
Without the red line.
But that
This
is,
one is what it will look like. This is easier to read.
gotcha.
This is what it will look like. This is the kind of language that you'll need to approve.
So maybe we can just go over where we are, right, or at least option 1, option 2, and option 3, if you don't mind. And prior drafts, we were looking at what if a property had single family or two family, we were going to facilitate, allow an accessory apartment. After a bunch of discussion in the office, we think it's appropriate to allow accessory apartments on
single-family
lots only right now, rather than.
And then two-family?
What's that?
You said you're excluding two-family then?
Yes.
Okay.
There's just so much into this. And, we were trying to, when we got on the discussion last week of primary residence, owner occupied, which one had to be a primary resident, which one could be the owner, where could the owner live? And then if they're in the second, if there's 3 units on the property after an accessory apartment goes in, can one of them be rented regardless? Doesn't matter if it's a primary residence or not. I mean, it was just spiraling into this place that wasn't good. So we had talked about options where the owner, so this initially started, if you remember, someone wanted to be able to live in the accessory apartment. The owner wanted to live in the accessory apartment. So that's where we started. And then we started kind of going into these other places, which is normal and good. But I think we've got to a place for option one. This is a tweak to the existing ordinance, which would give the owner the choice of where to live. The owner could live in either one. But both residences, the primary unit and the accessory, would be required to be the primary residence of the occupants, and it requires the owner to live in one of them. The other one has to be a primary residence. That's option one. That requires the owner, again, to live on the property in either one, and the primary residence of the other one being for the occupant. So that's option one. Option two requires primary residency for both units, but does not require the owner to live on the property. Option three is wide open, would not require, and this just says that a single-family dwelling, a lot with a single-family dwelling on it, can have no more than one accessory apartment, and that is it. There is no residency requirement, no owner to live on the property requirement. Those are the three options that I think are we ought to discuss. From my perspective, I've talked to the town manager today about it. I mean, and Audra's got a background in planning and community development as well. We're just, I think, coming from the perspective of requiring them to be the primary residence, both of them, but the owner not to be required to live on the property. That would be my recommendation.
So that would be option two.
That would be option two.
I think one important factor we have to look at
Yep.
here is why are there accessory apartments? And the accessory apartment was developed for non-conforming lots and to increase density
Without the lot size.
without increasing the lot size.
So if you notice, and thanks for bringing that up, in this version, the accessory apartment definition says, and it brings that up, Mark, it includes that in the definition, a dwelling unit of 600 square feet or less gross of living area on a lot with a single-family dwelling, otherwise too small an area to accommodate an additional dwelling. So we included that reasoning behind it in the definition, and I think that's important. I do.
Oh, I think it's a key factor.
And so,
I mean, was there anything else that you wanted to say about that? Was that leading on to something?
It was.
and I'm sorry, Mark, to interrupt. I was just trying to get to where I agree with you. I'm interrupting
I
again.
feel like he said half of what he was going to say, and I just was waiting for the other half.
Yeah. So the intent of this was to create higher density within downtown. Okay, it wasn't to create business entities, vacation rentals per se, in downtown.
Okay,
That was my point.
right.
Yeah, I think for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to be better off if we stay away from any of the short-term rental discussions. I know that they get intertwined, but
Yeah,
that's a separate thing.
Yes,
That
I think
is
it's
a separate
appropriate.
issue.
But appreciate that what you're saying is that the accessory apartment is not designed to just be, whatever. But I think that right now we just need to focus on these options and what they do best for our view for the town.
Mark, you said that it was the entity for condensed living. Would you say better that it was an entity to do that? The sole purpose wasn't for increased density, was it? I thought there were other characteristics of this that.
Like what?
Well, I mean, it would be to offer like an in-law living situation. Would be one other possible motivation. It does increase density.
To get more
But
To get-
just because it increases density doesn't mean it doesn't have another valid purpose. I
To
think
get
that's
more
what,
value out of your property, with being able to build something else on a substandard or subsidized lot?
I don't see that as being the intention here and what we're aiming at. I don't think it's about increasing property value. I think my understanding was that one of the reasons this has been brought to us and we're looking at this, it's to allow people in town to age in place.
And I agree with you.
And increase density, so provide some more affordable housing for people in
which
town.
also, that's a good way of putting it, 'cause that also covers the in-law situation and things like that as well.
Yes, and I think in-law was one of the intents also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think it's really good to stay focused on what the intention is as we discuss these. Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
So I think that's a very good point, and I guess one additional point on this would be, like the RU1, right, is our zone that just is single-family only. And so you can't have that option to get a second unit in it, regardless of your lot size. So I guess for me, and I think I can wordsmith something, because I think it's important to keep it in there about the otherwise too small to accommodate an additional dwelling. In the RU1, the lots, it doesn't matter, right? You can't add that second unit anyway. But I'd like to be able to allow people in the RU1 to have the option. So I'm going to you understand where I'm going?
I do. You want to add this option to RU1.
Uh-huh. So I think I can wordsmith something in that talks about generally,
Well,
go ahead.
what's to wordsmith? You just add it as, under RU1, add it as a.
Well, I guess for me, in the definition, if I'm including this area, and maybe we don't need to include it in the definition, otherwise too small.
Or otherwise prohibited or something, or otherwise.
Right, maybe otherwise prohibited is maybe the better terminal for, phrasing.
Aren't you allowing it by changing amending Article 8, Section
Why
2,
else?
rural RU1? I mean, you're talking about amending.
Correct, but we're not,
Allowed uses.
Why use any of that wording? Why not just go with on a lot with a single-family dwelling to accommodate an additional dwelling?
or I'm fine with that.
I like that.
Because, we can always, the intent is always not needed in the ordinance or in the definition, right?
Exactly.
Right. So I think that makes sense. Can I anyone else have thoughts on this one? And again, this one requires the primary residency of both units, but the owner's not required to be there.
I think this is the safe way forward. And you cover the RU1 with the state-of-Maine subsurface wastewater rules.
Right. And shoreline zoning issues and all that are all addressed in that.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with it. I think it's a good safe path forward. And
This is
then
option one?
two. And then,
Which is
and then
a town's
eventually we'll, hopefully somebody will do something about short-term rentals and then we can.
Correct.
Not worry
I think that's right. And again, just for people that walked in, we had three options we've been looking at, and Steve, I know you had some great comments last week. The board really appreciated your comments, and then you left, which I get. I would leave here too sometimes. But then it just spiraled into this very in-depth conversation. You did. I think your input was very appropriate, and I think everyone, when you first said it, was nodding their head and understanding, and then things just kept going. So I have drafted three new options. It only allows, you got them? Okay, perfect.
Oh, good.
Perfect. And then maybe if we can move on to the next, the other two options, options 1 and 3, and say yay or nay, or do you want to just move forward and someone make a motion that you like this option 2, and we'll move that forward to a hearing?
Do you want to summarize the other two?
Sure.
I already did.
I did already, but I'll do it again. Option 1 is a tweak to the existing one, the existing ordinance that just simply would allow still requires the owner to be on property, but says that the owner can live in either one and does not need to live in the primary use structure. That's option 1. Option 3 is wide open, and this is again for just single-family lots with single-family homes. Just says that you can do an accessory unit. Accessory apartment does not require any residency, does not require any ownership to live on the property. And again, option 2 requires the one that appears everyone is content with, requires primary residency of both units, but does not require the owner to live on the property.
I do appreciate the single-family dwelling aspect, simplifying it. nice and
It does. And then, I mean, from a building code perspective, it gets complicated too, because you add a 3-unit and it's attached, then you're into sprinkler systems, and then, you know, I hate going down a road, and I mean, oftentimes we can just deal with it because it's a separate code. It's not the zoning ordinance. Zoning ordinances allow something. Building code may not allow you to do it. But rather than to potentially get people's hopes up that hey, I got a 2-unit, I'm going to add another unit, and then they come in here and meet with Steve, and he says, well, you're going to have to sprinkle. And then it just, you know, that just creates a lot of bad.
With 3 units, you have to sprinkle? Or
Yes.
above 3?
3.
Multifamily.
Is that a Camden?
No, that's building code.
Open new units, yes.
What's that?
The new units.
Yes, no, this is not retroactive to,
Okay.
you know, a 3-unit that's out there in Camden right now that was permitted years ago.
7-unit apartment buildings, yeah.
Could you go back and look at that language again that Jeremy brought up?
So
On a lot with a single-family dwelling?
I think what we were thinking was, I think Mark said a dwelling unit of 600 square feet gross of living area on a lot. And then with a single-family dwelling otherwise too small is gone in area, so it just becomes on a lot to accommodate an additional dwelling.
Well, I don't think it reads well, but the point is to help people distinguish when it is an accessory apartment and when it is not. And if the lot can take 2 apartments, 2 units, it's not. And I think it, maybe which otherwise cannot accommodate an additional dwelling, which would cover the RU.
Yeah, because I'm getting what Jeannie's saying. It doesn't read as clearly as it could.
The link doesn't work as well. It's like,
The gross, is that implying that it's from, that includes all the square footage of the building? Or
That's
does-
in the definitions.
That's in the definition, yeah.
So
So it needs to be in
the
there.
proposal from Mark and Jeremy was to say on a lot and then cross out with a single-family dwelling. Otherwise,
With a single-family dwelling.
Otherwise too small an area.
otherwise
accommodate
too
an
small
additional dwelling.
in area. And Jeannie, your proposal was to add,
To say something like, on a single-family dwelling, which otherwise cannot accommodate an additional dwelling?
so on a lot which otherwise not accommodate, cannot.
Why does it matter?
I mean,
that-
that's just changing too small to cannot accommodate.
Well, that doesn't work for RU1 because they
Yeah.
can't accommodate them anyway.
It does if it says which otherwise cannot accommodate a second dwelling unit. It does include.
Okay, I mean, I get where you're going.
But I think you need to help distinguish why, when it is an accessory apartment instead of just
An apartment,
an apartment.
another unit.
So what, is that the size that makes it an accessory
The
apartment?
size of the lot.
Because you can't put another unit on
But
it.
it's also the size of the apartment.
Right,
So-
but if I mean, I could make an apartment and not call it an accessory apartment, 600 square feet,
Yeah, and if it's
Right,
on a,
Two-family dwelling.
and it's just a two-family
and if it's
dwelling.
on a lot that's big enough to accommodate both of those, then that's fine.
Correct.
Right, but there are no rules in that case. You want to make it clear when these rules are going to apply.
Oh, I see, so.
Lot size is
yes.
critical to that.
If the lot size is big enough to accommodate two full-size family units,
Or if
then
there may be other rules that prohibit it, like in the RU1.
One, which you can't do a 2-unit.
You can't have it to, so there may be other factor than lot size, but
right, okay.
See, I think we may be trying to complicate it here, and because it's, the point is, it's a 600 square foot unit. All right? It doesn't matter. I mean, that's what makes it an accessory apartment, a 600 square foot unit. All right? If you go 610 square feet, then you are a multifamily.
Two.
Two-family. Okay, so you have 120,000 square feet on your property. So if you want to build a 600 square foot accessory apartment on that, why couldn't you? But
you can, but the rules won't apply. The rules regarding primary residency won't apply.
Whichever one of these versions we have, that would fall under not these rules, whichever one of these we adopt or recommend, it would fall not under these, but just under regular, whatever the zoning rules and the other rules are. It wouldn't be an accessory apartment at that point.
correct.
So Jeannie, you're just proposing to replace too small an area with cannot.
I don't care what the language is, I just think that you
We
need,
could keep something that says otherwise too small in the area to accommodate, and then also, or prohibited, or elsewhere prohibited.
How about this? You end that sentence, to accommodate an additional dwelling on a non-conforming lot.
Well, no, because if I'm in the RU1 and I have a lot that's 60,000 square feet, my lot's conforming.
Yeah, all the setbacks and
I don't have a problem with the way it's written or.
My lot's conforming, and then I want to be able to add people ought to be able to add a dwelling unit there.
So I'll just go on record and say, I don't have a problem with the way it's written or with Jeannie's proposal, but I'm not getting the mixing it up with the other lots and that, so.
I'm with you.
I think our effort to simplify it in a way has made it more complex. And it was good the way I read on here.
All right, is everyone happy? Can I mean, I don't think we need we don't need a motion on this since we're going to, I'm going to tweak this and refine it a little bit more for a public hearing. Is everyone okay with requires the primary residency but not the owner to live?
I think
Everyone's
that's the
good with
cleanest way
that?
to handle some of the issues that Bruce, is it?
Steve,
Steve brought up, and also that we had talked about. I think it's the cleanest way to do that. I'm not really in favor personally of opening it up to number 3. I think that's a little too broad.
Agree?
Yeah.
I understand.
I think it's good to consider, but I think this is the best sort of, I look at it as pretty much a straight compromise, sort of a balance of the two options that we considered, and then finding a sort of a clean path down the middle.
Everyone good with that?
Yeah, I agree. And
Some public comment? Sure. Steve, do you mind
You seem to be
grabbing the mic?
You wouldn't mind just speaking? Do you
on number 2.
Press that button.
Yes.
want to just press the button, Steve? Thank you.
Well, number 2 eliminates one of the scenarios that I brought up last meeting, which is the inheritance factor. If the house is inherited, people have died or gone into elderly housing, and the inheritors can't live in it full-time now because of jobs or whatever, they can't come up and use it during the summer. It's got to have 2 full-time residents in it. It's pretty tough to find a 6-month resident that you can then throw out for the summer. The other thing is, I don't remember when the accessory apartment law got on the books. okay? But I do remember that several years ago, when the town did a major reevaluation of real estate, there was a mini boom in building these things. And one of the reasons there was a mini boom is that people needed the extra income. And I think, as long as we're going to continue to do things like build a $25 million school, that we have to be a little bit generous about how we, let people utilize their property. And I favor the idea where just one of these has to be a full-time resident, because I think people need that income. We build a new school, it's a good chance they're going to be building new dams in the next few years. It's like nothing gets cheaper. And we talk about letting people stay in their homes because of the tax burden, and certainly the versatility to move into, the smaller unit. That's part of letting people keep their property. But there's a significant income difference between summer rental and winter rental. And other families' ability, other members of your own family, their ability to use it. If the older couple moves into the smaller unit, take my word for it, 600 square feet is one bedroom or a studio. You have kids, you have grandkids, you want them to come up and visit during the summer. Where do they go? They go into a $400 a night B&B? Whereas if you have the flexibility, that other unit, rent it some weeks, let the family use it other weeks, et cetera, that strikes me as fairer. The other thing is, we're talking about this in a kind of a vacuum without thinking about the restaurant industry in town, day sailors, all the people that depend on visitors, downtown businesses. I don't think they're going to have a really favorable reaction if we knock the ability of a significant percentage of people to come and visit and stay. My opinion.
Well, I didn't
Couple of
follow the second point about I understand I think it's a good point about maybe requiring both units to be occupied or, residences, full-time residences.
I didn't make that point.
You said, right, I know, but you said that what we did was actually still keep that in there, which didn't address your point.
No.
I think he wants one of the units to be a primary.
I'm pretty
the
sure I
other-
understand that, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
one, not both.
Right. What we had here had both. That's what I'm saying,
Right.
yeah. And you're saying that we should only have one. I get that point. What I'm not.
And I don't think it necessarily has to be an owner.
Right, I think we
nixed that idea.
Yeah.
Go on.
So what I didn't follow is, how, if we address that point that was the second one just sort of a tangential to the other one, that we were limiting by having it primary residence, and then so therefore we were limiting options? Is that so? It's just an example. I guess I didn't follow. Okay, yeah, I do follow now. Thanks. I agree with you to a point on the requiring both to be full-time residences, primary residences.
One question is, who are we hurting? It's like, by letting one be non-resident and maybe, doesn't mean it's going to be rented every single week during the summer to a different person. But by letting that happen, by letting those rentals exist, I don't think we're hurting anybody. Right, if this goes through, okay, that besides a B&B or a motel or whatever, then the only thing you could rent would be an empty, standalone house on a lot, which they're available somewhat. They're expensive.
I think I follow the
For a
reasoning.
vacation rental. For
Yeah.
a vacation rental, which I know you almost don't want to deal with this, but you can't not deal with it. You're dealing with it by doing this. If you go with the option that says both units have to be occupied by full-time residents, okay, then the only thing a person or a family coming to visit Camden can rent besides a hotel room or a B&B, et cetera, or an inn, is an empty or a house that someone has emptied out for a little while for the purpose of renting it, a single-family home on a lot. That's all that will be available.
Well, there are apartments that are rentable by the week.
See, what,
Can't be too many of them. I'm not aware of any of
Can't
them.
currently rent the accessory apartments short-term.
well, yes, exactly. That's
Right.
what we're dealing with
Currently,
right
you're not
now,
allowed to
okay?
do that.
Currently, you cannot rent an accessory apartment as a vacation rental, okay? And what this change in the ordinance was addressing was allowing the property owner to live in the accessory apartment and be able to rent his
I
house.
understand that, but in changing that, which is great, adding these other factors of full-time occupancy, it's a consequence.
It's already required.
It's not a change of consequences, though. What it's doing is it's adding another level and another dimension to the change that we're proposing.
All right, for example, you have a house with an accessory apartment, okay? The older couple moves into,
The accessory apartment.
okay, the accessory apartment. You're creating the rule that says they can't rent the other part.
Short-term.
Right.
But that rule was already, that rule exists
But it
now.
wasn't there for single-family homes.
Right. So if you want to rent the house out, you don't have an accessory apartment.
All right, obviously, I know that's the consequence. I'm just saying that I don't agree with it. You know, I think the people that come here renting for short period, they're also a vital part of the community. They're the ones that are eating in the restaurants, shopping downtown, taking day sales.
I'll say I agree with you. I mean, last time we discussed, that was my argument completely, was that all of a sudden you have an accessory apartment, it kind of pigeonholes these properties, and no other properties have this contingency. So every other property can do short-term rentals as long as they're, doing it by the books, unless you have an accessory apartment. Once you have an accessory apartment, no short-term rentals. And that was my argument. And I think that what we're doing here is a compromise. It's kind of a step forward because we don't have a good handle on our short-term rental rules at this time. And I would feel more comfortable going this more conservative route versus opening it right up right away. And then when we get a better handle on the short-term rental rules, we can come back and open it up a little bit more. That's kind of my hopes.
Well, I
That's
think,
my take on it also.
Yeah.
you might find a little more participation when you get to a public hearing from those who are going to be more impacted by this. And it will also be interesting to do significant research of, well, how many places are offered for rent in town and how many have accessory apartments or whatever. I mean, I do know people that have, moved out of their single-family homes for a few weeks during the summer just to kind of pick up some income that they need to pay the taxes.
I
We'll
don't believe
live.
this
See,
isn't going to stop you doing that.
All right.
Nothing in this would stop someone from doing that. I mean, the reality is we're saying, we're defining what primary residence is, right? And that's 6 months plus 1 day. So my experience in dealing with short-term rentals, especially Airbnb, in Camden and in Belfast, for instance, people live in their homes as their primary residence for the fall, the winter, and the spring. And then when you're saying that visitors come, they're renting their property on Airbnb for the summer. That is
Well, we also
specifically
have
allowed
another-
under this.
We do have a protective rule in town in terms of the character of our summer renters, that we have a 7-day minimum. That's a lot different than Airbnb 2 or 3 day a weekend rentals.
You can still Airbnb it. It's just that you can't have 2-3 day rentals in a week. You can rent it out for 3
Right.
days, then you have to
And-
get to that 7-day rule, and then you can do another 3-day rental. You can still use it.
No, you have to rent to a rental party. Your rental party has to be 7 days.
That, I will say that if you, by the letter of the law, it says 7 days, you can't rent it for less than that. but it is a standard practice. I'm just throwing this out there that we know that there are people that rent for less, but they are not allowed to flip that property over in that 7-day period. It's as if no one's there for day 4, 5, 6, and 7. That's what.
Just aren't living there for a couple of days.
Correct. I'm just saying that that's the practice and what's happening. I'm not saying that's right, but that's how it's been handled. I will say one of the other key pieces to this, and every community, it appears every community across the country is trying to add accessory dwelling units, and it's not for the Airbnbs. It is to provide housing especially in Maine, where we have a housing crunch, significant housing crunch on the mid-coast, and accessory apartments do provide for, whether it be small families, couples, working professionals, to live in this town where we are not seeing a slug of new residential development. We're not seeing that anywhere in the mid-coast, and housing is an issue, and accessory apartments, and I appreciate the desire to be able to, for people to be able to rent them for money, short-term wise, but we need desperately housing in town to serve as people's primary residences. CDAC has said that, the Select Board has said that. I'm talking to housing people up and down the coast and meeting with them all the time that this is an issue. And one way to combat that is to have an ordinance amendment that liberalizes accessory apartments. And I certainly value and appreciate the summer folks' needs here. This doesn't take that away. It doesn't, because again, it's six months in a day. So someone can be here all fall, winter, and spring, and I know people that do it. They live in their house spring, winter, and fall, and even with kids, and then they move out for the summer, so that they rent their place. That's still allowed.
So just to speak to Steve's
Yeah.
comment about, what if you inherit this property, you don't live here, right? You still need to pay the property taxes, keep it running, you'd like to make some money on it. My understanding is that under option 2, you can still rent that property
Both of them.
out. It's just that you can't do short-term rentals with them. What you're going to do is rent out to year-round people, so you can still have 2 rental incomes coming.
Well, in theory, you could still have summer rentals, because your definition of a full-time person is 6 months.
Right.
And a day.
Yes.
And
So-
you haven't, actually, in either case, okay, maybe not on the accessory apartment, but it doesn't prevent you from renting the house on a weekly basis if it's been occupied, October through whatever.
So then how does this, how is this a hardship? How is option 2 a hardship? That's what I'm not quite understanding that piece,
Yeah.
to be honest
How
with
does
you.
It just takes a lot of work for the person who's inheriting.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine you have to, and you want to use it during the summer or even rent it during the summer. Well, you have to find someone you're labeling as a full-time occupant for 6 months.
Yeah.
And what? Go have them verified?
See,
Well, it is a lot. I mean, yes, rental property
Stamp,
takes work
you know.
and you make money from it, and that's, I have 8 rental properties, and it does take a lot of work and time. And short-term rentals take more time and effort than long-term rentals do. You make more money off them in the summer, So, yes, it's work, for sure, that you're making money from it, so why wouldn't it be work?
And there's a negative impact on your apartment rental when you're renting it short term, as opposed to long-term rentals. The impact that does physically to your house, to your property on short-term rentals is very different than a long-term renter. I'm just from experience.
Depends who it is. We get a pretty
Steve, you brought up
high
the
caliber
point.
of renters.
You brought up the point that a public hearing, people that are negatively affected by this change will speak out. Nobody will be negatively affected because people with current accessory apartments cannot rent short-term.
I understand that.
So
It's really a
Doesn't-
question of, how many units, and no one here has produced any statistical thing of how many accessory apartments there are, et cetera. it's certainly probably going to reduce the amount of rentals available for families.
Why would that be?
See, we're sitting here saying that, okay, well, whatever unit we're talking about, the big part of the house, well, you can get someone in there for 6 months, and then you're free to do what you want during the summer. Well, those 6-month rentals aren't very easy to come by.
No, so your other
A whole lot
alternative.
of people that want to come to Maine for the winter.
But to be honest with you, Steve, what it seems like what we're trying to do here is increase year-round affordable rental accommodation. So ideally, what this is encouraging is for you to rent your house out full-time to somebody who needs a full-time rental situation here.
You're encouraging that, and at the same time, you're limiting it.
How are
In other
we-
words,
how are
if
we
you just
limiting it?
say that if you keep the thing that, the people can move to the small unit has to be occupied by a full-time person, then, you still have the same, but, I don't think you increase so much the year-round resident rentals by offering big houses in Camden. I mean, the young people that we're talking about, how much are those houses going to rent for?
We're really just talking about the existing rule with its limitations and opening it up more.
Right.
So we're not limiting anything that is already there. Now, we can go down the road of hypotheticals and say, in this circumstance, this person would not be able to do X. One of your examples is somebody who inherits the house, they get a full-time renter in there, and so they can't come visit for 2 weeks in the summer. Okay, that is some sort of consequence to this. It's not one that I think is a huge issue. It's not something that I think we need to craft our code around. The off chance that somebody inherits a house and wants to visit for 2 weeks in the summer, and if they want to do that, if it's that important to them, they can figure out a rental situation that works for them. They can figure out a way to get a person in there who's going to go take a 2-week vacation when they decide to come up and visit. I know it's not easy, but it's not up to us to anticipate every single possible person that inherits a house in Camden and wants to come and stay for a couple of weeks. That's our goal, is to find people. You can quibble with the definition of primary residence, but it's a pretty standard definition. It's 6 months and a day, and that will, as Rosie has suggested, encourage full-time renters. That's what it will. That's what it does. You're right. It is hard to get somebody for 6 months and a day. So what it really is encouraging is families. It is encouraging people to move into the town and stay here and be full-time residents. And that's what we're trying to work with the existing definition and give more options. And that allows the owner to live in either unit. It doesn't even require now an owner.
Correct.
It just requires the residency. And that, I think, at least I'm speaking for myself, but I think that addresses our concern that these not just become, full-time short-term rental, units, and also allows the flexibility to the owners without handcuffing them to one structure.
Ethan, thank you. I think that was very well said.
Can you condense it now?
Just my motion, man.
I think you hit the points right on the head, right there.
Yeah.
And Rosie, I never picked up anything from this that suggested what you implied of affordability.
Well,
Like I don't sense this as an invitation for more affordable housing or an entree for more affordable housing in town.
Well, these smaller units are going to be cheaper.
Right.
That's just by nature.
They're 600 square feet.
Square foot, but they're cheaper. You can't charge.
They're not cheaper if you use Steve's, concept of a couple moving out of the big house into the little house. It's like,
but this also allows you to stay in your big house and have an accessory apartment which you rent to somebody, which then you rent, and that's a lower rent. So that allows you to offer a more reasonable rent to somebody in town.
Or it allows the owner, the elderly couple, to move out of their big house into the accessory. And actually, this is an instance that someone asked me about. allows their kids with their grandkids to move into that other house.
Right.
So now you have, two generations, three, together on the same property.
And the way Steve just brought it, it's like those kids might not be able to move into the big house because they might not have jobs in this area. And, that's a reality too.
It's a reality, but I mean, we are, again, up and down the mid-coast, housing is an issue. And accessory apartments is a way to combat that and try to get more housing, and it's an issue for many, many reasons. I mean, the labor shortage is a huge piece of that. And we're not going to fix the labor shortage if we don't have people, and we're not going to have people if we don't have housing.
Ethan, based on your very well thought out statement, do you see any changes that are necessary in option 2, or do you like it as is?
Yes, I think option 2 looks fine as is. I was considering Steve's suggestion about making just one unit. It had some appeal to me, but under, consideration of all the factors and where we're coming from and where we want to go, I think the safest road
It's
is
safer.
number 2. Yeah.
Yeah. That's kind of how I feel.
I agree.
Steve?
Just, not necessarily trying to change your mind here. I see which way it's going. It's just, there are lots of factors that just aren't even being talked about here. One is, so the couple that rents an accessory apartment on a year-round basis, okay? Well, that's probably going to be affordable because it's only 600 square feet. But of course, that limits it to an individual or a couple, pretty much, okay? Then the larger house in Camden becomes available if this elderly couple moves, okay? Where is that going to fall in affordability? And does that stand any chance of helping the problem of keeping working people here, finding housing for working people? I just imagine, most houses in Camden are pretty sizable and pretty expensive, and those rents.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's plenty of smaller houses around all the neighborhoods that I walk around with my dog, all over in the back by,
Do they have accessory apartments?
this is the whole point. They're allowed to.
Well,
And if they're allowed to, I mean, saying that Camden has big houses and they cost a lot to rent doesn't change my opinion. Camden does have some big houses that are expensive,
Lots.
but it also has plenty of small houses that may not be cheap,
Okay.
but they're going to be a lot more affordable than somebody's bedroom mansion.
then the next question to ask would be, given the fact that a 600 square foot place and how much it could rent for versus the cost of building that place, if you're trying to encourage new housing units, et cetera, is that an economic formula that makes sense?
No, because that 600 square foot house
we don't
costs
handle that.
substantially more to build because it's small.
Then the rent that's going to be generated.
Yes and no. I mean, it could be a garage, you could be building a garage, and you put the accessory apartment over the garage.
Correct.
And, or you could be taking the wing of your house and turning that into an accessory apartment.
Right, you're not talking about necessarily building a
Yeah, we're not,
structure.
we're just getting off base here.
And I mean, for instance, I have a friend who had to leave her big house in town, right? And she had a heck of a time trying to find a smaller house in town because there are very few of them for sale. If she could have spent about 150,000, which is probably what it would have cost to put a small accessory apartment unit of this size up, and she could have put that in her backyard, which would have been big enough under this ordinance, she wouldn't have had to struggle and go buy a $250,000 house, which doesn't really completely meet her needs. She could have built this apartment and rented out her big house, and that would have been well worth it for her to spend the money on doing that.
Well,
And to your other point, I just want to say what I see the 20-something-year-olds in town doing when they need to, say, apartments down on Bayview Street are about $1,500 a month. So they double up, and two of them share that rental. And that tends to be what young people do when they're single. You just,
Roommates.
but no, not roommates, but
In
flatmates,
600
apartment mates.
square feet.
No, you were concerned about how young people were going to afford a house or a bigger house. So tends to be what they do. You double up and you get an apartment. No, that's.
There are a million different circumstances, and I'm just saying that, they'll all come to light at some point. To use your example, I'm not sure I would go to the problem of building a $150,000 apartment and pay additional taxes for something on a year-round basis I could probably only rent for maybe $700 a month.
No, she's talking about moving into that apartment and then being able to maintain ownership of the large house and rent that out. To her,
Or
that
vice
would be,
versa.
to her, that might have value.
I understand that some people's fear of this accessory apartment thing is that all kinds of people and investors are going to show up, buy a house and build an accessory apartment and rent both.
That is a concern, for sure.
Yeah, that's a concern.
And that's happening. Not necessarily in Camden, but we've seen it happening. It's happening in California. It's happening down in New Orleans. There's all sorts of evidence
understand
of
that.
that.
Mind if an
That's why we're
investor
going-
comes into town to buy up a property to put an accessory apartment on it because they're both being rented as primary residences.
Yeah.
It's still happening.
And that's why we're keeping that in
It may not
there.
happen. I mean, there may not be enough revenue out of renting both to justify doing something like that.
That's not our,
Yeah.
we don't,
That's our problem vis-à-vis this.
But renovating that wing of your house into a second unit is much more reasonable to do, and provides another unit in town.
The way we should be looking at this is, what do we want our town to be looking like, and how do we want it to grow? Simple as that, I think.
I gotta go. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think based on what y'all said, I think we've got a good consensus on this one, option 2. I'll draft the final language for that, and we'll schedule a public hearing on that. I don't think we need to do any motion or anything on this, just a nod.
That was not motion.
Send it to public hearing and it's a motion.
Oh, yes, we do need a motion to send it to public hearing.
So, and it's just as written here.
Likely, but I have to, I'm going to look at that language on the otherwise too small, so we don't mess with the RU1 or the CR. I just don't want to, I want to be able to allow those zones to have these. So I'm confident that, we'll have the language done in time for the public hearing. Okay? It'll be done in time. What law requires us to have the language done by a certain date, that will be done.
So can you, yeah, never mind. Oh, I understand it.
Okay. Can we have a motion to send it to public hearing?
I move to send option 2
As generally written?
as generally written to public hearing.
I second that. All those in favour? Aye. 5-0.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot on that one. There's a lot there,
There is, and it's complicated,
It is.
and we can't ever fully understand all the consequences.
Address every single one either.
We could we can get from the assessing office some kind of idea about how many lots this would apply to within the village and village extension, right?
Yeah.
That are too small, otherwise too small, like under 10,000 square feet.
I don't know, if
Or
we-
under 15,000 square
short-term
feet.
rentals were coming in, then yeah, but
Right.
we're keeping them separate.
You're not addressing that with
Yeah,
us.
so I think,
Good for now. I think once we get into the short-term rental discussions, that's a whole nother thing. All right, move on to,
Okay.
and maybe what I'll do, because there are folks here, we'll not talk about the BTR and B1 right now. We'll just
Demo, I'm guessing.
delay.
You folks are here for demolition.
Demolition review,
Right.
sorry.
Demo type people.
Sorry about that.
That's fine. Yeah, let's deal with that.
Okay. Quick and easy one first, anyway. Article 13, Historic Resources Committee. if we do this and move forward, we do have to add duties of the Historic Resources Committee into Article 13. So I did that by adding a number 11, says review demolition permit applications per Article 5, Section 2, 1A. That's all that change is.
Lost me. Where are you?
So,
Okay, yeah,
So in order to
Okay.
add the language into that, you need
Okay.
to have this.
Gotcha.
Just to give
Okay,
them
thank
authority
you.
to review the permit.
Thank you.
What that does?
Yep.
All right. And,
so what's
go ahead, Mark.
Article 5, Section 2?
Go to this, proposed zoning ordinance
It's
amendment.
It's the
required.
permit required section,
Right.
yes. And
Section 2.
1A. So right now, Article 5, Administration Enforcement, Section 2, Permits Required, has just, as a subsection 1. What I'm proposing to add is a 1A,
Gotcha.
okay? Make sense?
And this becomes the 1A right here.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Okay. That's what that does. And just what you have in front of you, you have, I think, a summary, intent, purpose, and what ordinances are covered. That does not become part of the ordinance, just so for people's information. This is just kind of a summary of what it does, what the ordinance does. And there is some verbiage that I need to tweak. I haven't had a second to do that. I have met with Pat Scaling and Michael and Dennis and Judy McGurk, who are here, and they are on the, three of you, I think, are on the Historic Resources Committee, right, Mike? I don't think you are.
Two of us are volunteers.
Is that you and Dennis? You guys got the good job. Okay. Okay, so I met with them and reviewed this section. They have some comments and some wording changes for the intent, purpose, and process overview. I don't think we need to go great into detail on that at all. That's just, it's not the ordinance that goes to public hearing. So I just wanted to go through the proposed ordinance amendment right now. And there is some, they provided me some other additional comments on this section as well, but nothing too varied from how it reads right now. So I don't know if you want me to read through this for the record, or do you guys want to, have you read this at all yet? So in essence, what this does, this says if someone wants to demolish a building that is in our historic overlay zone, there are three districts, High Street, Chestnut, and the Great Fire District. Those are on our historic overlay map. This would also cover properties that are currently under consideration for National Register designation. And I'm going to get a list that we would include in that for now, if that's okay. I think that's important. Right now, that's just Elm Street, I believe, correct? And Jacobs, correct. And that's, all right. We can keep that in the Elm Street and Jacobs Avenue are the ones that are currently under listing. And then it would, under review. And then it would also apply to individual properties that lie outside of a registered district but are on the National Register of Historic Places. Okay? And how this would work, if you're going to propose to demolish one of those properties, you have to submit an application to the code officer. The code officer then, within a certain time period, we have to send a notice to abutters, and then the Historic Resource Committee gets a notice as well. Then within 30 days, the Historic Resources Committee will schedule a meeting with that property owner or the applicant that's proposing to demolish it, and where they would work with each other, hopefully in good faith, to propose to look at other alternatives to full demolition. including restoring it, repurposing it, potentially moving it, possible new ownership. All those things are standard in historic preservation ordinances, like much bigger preservation ordinances. That's not what this is. This is just a demolition review ordinance. We're not going down the road of full historic preservation review. So the committee holds that public meeting, and the code officer cannot issue a demo permit for 120 days from the date of that submittal of that application. And that gives the interested parties, neighbors, Historic Resources Committee, and that applicant time to look at possible alternatives again. And if it turns out that the applicant is just bent on moving forward on demolishing that property, they can do that. This does not prohibit someone from doing that, but it does provide a dialogue with interested folks to be at a table and talking and discussing those issues. If someone decides to demolish that property, the ordinance would then require them to prepare a historic recordation of the property, consistent with the Park Services standards for building engineering recordation, and a photographic would require a black and white photographic archival.
Recordation.
Yes.
What's recordation? Is
That's-
that in Webster's?
It's actually in the National Park Service's guidelines on how you deal with historic properties when you're going to demolish them, or you're going to have a significant, or there's a significant negative impact on a property. So oftentimes, historic properties that are reviewed on the federal level because there's a federal undertaking, or in a community that has a historic preservation ordinance, if you go through the process and someone finds, and a review agency finds that what is being proposed has a detrimental impact or effect on the historic character of that property, but they're going to say nothing is preventing you from demolishing that or changing that feature. What they do then say is, for historical preservation purposes and research purposes, you are required to hire a qualified professional to document that building. And that means you do an engineering study of that building, and you do drawings, and you do black and white archival photographic images of that print. On the federal level, they get put in the Library of Congress. What I would suggest is the town gets a copy and the Camden Public Library gets a copy, so that everyone will have the ability forever to be able to know what building was where. It was a significant property in town. They're able to know what that building was moving forward. Go ahead.
You're going to do that for the ones that.
So how do you determine,
Do they only do that for what you're demoing, or do you?
What's that?
Do you only do it for what you're demoing, or do you do it for
So-
the whole building?
This ordinance is applying to a complete demolition of the property, is how this reads. This does not apply
Does
to.
actually. No, that's not what it reads.
We changed. Are you sure it says that?
And it also says this section also applies to building
whole or in
additions.
part of a
Additions,
building?
L's, or wings, correct, but
Yeah.
Only
complete
if they're determined to be historically significant.
demolition of the building, wings, or L's, okay, or additions to it. It does not apply to if I'm taking off decorative features, or changing the siding, or changing the trim.
How about not just demolition, but some work that's as deleterious as demolition is adding on inappropriate?
I understand, and I get that. What this ordinance is not is a review ordinance, and we do not have evaluation standards for review, like historic preservation review or design review. We do not have a commission. You would need a full historic preservation commission established to do that review. We don't have that. The attempt here was, and I know the Historic Resources Committee, I think, would advocate for that. I think they will advocate for that in the future, and I probably will be on board advocating for that in the future, should something like this pass. I mean, we don't know. I mean, the last time this was brought up, historic demolition review was brought up, or at least preservation ordinance was brought up, it was shot down by the select board and was not moved forward at all. This is an attempt to preserve, hopefully preserve some buildings. I mean, again, no one is obligated to not demolish the building. I mean, if someone wants to demolish the building, they can demolish it.
Yeah.
But there's just a delay period, there's a waiting period, a review period that says, the town values these properties, the character. Can you please look at other options? We're not saying you have to, but can you please? And then if you're going to do it, we really care about these properties, so you're going to provide us with something so that everyone forever will be able to know what building was in this location, and we'll have it archived. I mean, that's the intent.
So what buildings are we trying to protect? I know High Street.
High Street, Chestnut.
Jacobs Ave, what's?
Chestnut Street.
So let me just, I can maybe touch on it, and maybe I'll ask some of the folks from the Historic Resource Committee. Oh, yeah. So this would apply to Chestnut Street Historic District, the Great Fire Historic District, and High Street Historic District, as well as properties that, districts that are currently under review to become national registered districts. There are 2 in town that fall under that category. Elm Street Historic, this process started back in 2002 of that review, just so you know. And then Jacobs Avenue. And the Historic Resource Committee has been they're the folks that are pushing this and looking at this review. The town fully knew the 2002 one was happening on Elm Street. That goes back 18 years. And the Jacobs Avenue one, I don't know when exactly that one started, but as I understand, the great majority of all the people on Jacobs Avenue are in favor of that.
And
I think
to your question, Mark, it's a street with a bunch of little bungalows that are all quite similar. Obviously, they all have little neat differences, but
What's the historic?
they're all bungalows built by, I think, the same time frame. I don't know,
Sears houses.
120 years ago or something.
Apparently they're not Sears houses.
I think Pat and maybe Judy can speak to that.
Where Matt Siegel lives.
Matt Siegel lives over there. I will say, people sometimes get worried or nervous if the feds or someone lists a property as historic. If you don't have a local historic preservation ordinance, which this is not, there is nothing anyone can tell you what you can do or can't do to that property. The only time that if you're listed as a historic property, that there's any review done in a town like Camden, because we don't have historic preservation ordinance, would be if there's a federal undertaking. So if someone over there says, sells it to the federal government, and the federal government puts in an office and wants to make changes, they fall under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and they would have to do a full historic review.
So the only intent of this entire ordinance proposal is to hinder anybody that wants to demolish a property. Doesn't protect anything. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any teeth. All it does is hinder them and require them to pay a lot of money to have it historically documented.
I might challenge that word hinder.
I was going to challenge it too, but go ahead.
No, you can.
What would you call
But
120
hinder
days?
to me just has like negativity implied, and
Okay, for negativity.
see, I told you should have spoken, Jerry.
No permit for the complete demolition, all right, is that, that's negativity right there. It starts out negative.
Okay, fine, but it's just a choice of word. I believe it delays an owner, doesn't hinder an owner.
Correct.
And delay could be hinder, but delay
And
doesn't necessarily mean hinder.
Well, okay.
It certainly increases the cost of demolition because whether or not you agree with it, it does increase the cost by requiring it to be recordated properly.
But there's a cost to a community losing all of its historic character too. And I think that is the grave concern of the Historic Resource Committee. I mean, they are way into this, and they're deep into it about protecting and preserving the character of Camden. And generally what happens, I mean, I will say for a background, they have looked at about every single historic preservation ordinance there is in New England, I think. They've looked in Massachusetts, they've looked in, I mean, at everyone in Maine, and I have as well.
They all have these same chapters.
I have a question. So we know the areas and the houses that we're looking at and we're concerned about. Why don't we just do what the town did a long time ago and record date those properties now? So that the individual owners don't have to do it themselves when they go to tear it down. And all we have to do is go and confirm that what we recorded now as a town is still what it is when they're trying to do the demo.
Who's going to do that? Who's going to pay for it?
I mean, I will say, what the Historic Resources Survey that gets done for,
Great project.
Yeah.
It's over on Pearl Street.
the Historic Resources Survey and inventory work that gets done for National Register listing is nowhere near what you get when you do a historic recordation and a photo archival documentation of the property. It's not at all the same.
Why couldn't we, do something similar and streamline it for the applicants?
Yeah, get to press that.
Yeah, and could you
think it's-
could you just say your name just for the record?
Pat Scaling, Historic Resources Committee. Yeah, I think it's a matter of money and
There's got to be grants or something.
time or something. I think that would be a good idea.
Time's kind of on our side. It's not like we have many people trying to demo.
I thought I might tell
Don't
you.
know. I mean, the reality is that where I was trying to go when we've looked at all these other communities, what ends up happening in these communities is those significant buildings that really are the character and provide that character in that community are all of a sudden one day, someone comes into a code office, applies for a demo permit, they get that permit, and the next day an excavator's out there demolishing a building that everyone in that community cherishes. And then what ends up happening is everyone is saying, how can the town let this happen? I mean, that's what happens. And then they go, okay, we need to do something. And
We
then-
really hope that in that delay period that we might be able to talk to them about, are there some alternatives? I think that works in a small town. I haven't had a experience with that, but I think that's one of the good things about the
Didn't
delay.
work great over in Rockport with that fence, did it? Someone put up a spike
I'm not
fence.
familiar with that. I thought I might just tell you the properties that are not in the historic district that are on the historic register, just for your information. You asked which buildings. Norumbega, actually, that is in the High Street Historic District, so I don't know why it's listed separately. But the post office, and that could be considered on Chestnut Street, but it's listed separately. The post office, Norumbega Carriage House, now the Mount Batty Tower, Curtis Island, the Conway House, the Yacht Club, the Public Library and Amphitheater, the Opera House, and the American Boathouse. And then there are 4 schooners that are also listed. But everything else is either on Chestnut Street, High Street, or the Great Fire District.
I don't see any one of those properties you just listed in jeopardy.
Your town.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that may be the Conway House. I'm not sure which one's the Conway House.
It's behind Hannaford on Conway
Okay.
Road.
It's a town property.
It is?
I think yeah.
Okay. So we just have really, you've got, of that, I mean, just of that list, it's small. I mean, you've got the Norumbega and the Norumbega Carriage House, right? Everything else appears to be town property or the feds under the post office. Outside of that, though, it's the districts, properties in the districts, and then right now Jacobs and Elm Street. The areas under review.
Elm Street to where? Like, what part of it?
Well,
The downtown Elm
it's,
Street?
it's been designated back in 2002, and
It doesn't go out to Quarry Hill. That's Elm Street.
yeah.
So-
I don't know how far it goes because we're just getting back to looking into
All right.
it. Judy can speak to that.
So let's look at one property, Camden Sunoco. Telling me if somebody bought that property, they cannot touch that for 120 days?
Which one?
Camden Sunoco?
Matt,
Does that fall within that area being reviewed?
Better
No,
place.
it doesn't. It starts with the Hearthstone Inn at both sides of the street and goes down into, I think, 94 Elm Street. So it's all those old houses that are now mostly.
Like the wellness center.
Bed and
Yes,
breakfast,
yes,
and
in
they're
that
mostly
area.
businesses.
I do think, though, that we need to discuss at some point, by the way, I never said I'm Judy McGurk,
Thank you.
Camden Historic Resources Committee. We do need to discuss things that are not yet on the National Register. I mean, I have a personal opinion about it, and I don't know that
I
the
know.
whole committee agrees with me. I think once the application has been submitted to the state, maybe at that point, they should be considered. But, I mean, we don't even know yet if the section of Elm Street we're looking at qualifies.
Right.
I've been talking to the state about it. I've given them our documentation, but the documentation was put together in 2003, and there's been some changes since then.
Right.
And there's new owners since then, not in every building, but there's new owners. So we haven't talked to any of those people. And Jacobs Avenue, probably the owners know that that's being considered, and they all agree. So that's a different situation. But I think we need to talk about at what point do we say, yes, they are being considered. I mean, we're considering a lot of areas, but, you can't, we haven't done the documentation.
Yeah.
We don't know if they're eligible.
Right, we don't know if they're eligible. So I hate to put them in a situation of saying you can't do something when they may never be on the National Register.
Right.
They may decide as a group they don't want to be.
Right.
Because the first
They-
step
we
is
have
to
to-
get the whole Elm Street group together and
Right.
say, is it something you're interested in? If 50% of them aren't interested, then.
Then we
that's-
don't
go
that's
for
that issue. We don't even bother. Yeah.
How much does it usually cost to get a recordation done?
That's what I'm curious.
What are we adding?
I've
to the
seen them for a
financial
few
burden?
$1,000s up to, and this is on an industrial building, I've seen them at 15,000. But that's an industrial building at a waterworks facility in Bangor, an old industrial building.
So you do have to do the whole building. You can't just do part of the building.
Right, the one in Bangor, and this is an industrial building, this is not at all a residential property. There were lots of changes, and the feds were involved. There was a significant negative impact or effect that was determined to be done, detrimental impact. So they ended up having to document a lot of stuff. There's industrial machinery, all that kind of stuff. That was like 15 grand. But I've seen them on a regular house, historic house, and I've seen them at 3,000.
But Jeremy, I think you would only do that on a building like, for instance, the Opera House. The homes or the buildings that are in these historic districts like on High Street, the National
They
Register,
will give us a chance to talk to the owner and explore some different ideas, because not everybody does it on their own, but with a little encouragement, we might be able to help save a couple of buildings. And that's just
I
my
see this as
thought.
like a good gesture, but I still think it's going to have to be received by a sensitive person who's going to follow it, rather than a developer who's oriented to like cash. 'Cause they'd be able to flow right through this.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
And, I mean, that's what you hope you have. You hope you have sensitive people who have moved here because they like the historic aspect of the town, and they don't want to ruin it by tearing their own down or whatever. I don't know what the answer is, though.
yeah.
I mean, I think
You know-
that some of the thinking behind this was that doing this incrementally, the goal behind doing something like this is a kind of compromise, and it's much more likely to actually get voted through.
Yeah.
And it's a start, and we may be able to move further in the future, but it's better to have something than nothing.
I think it'll be a great indicator to us and what the town really thinks about historic properties when it gets voted on. I mean, if the vote is 80% to 20% that say, yeah, we ought to have a review ordinance to look at historic properties when they're going to be proposed to be demolished, then it's overwhelmingly, the town wants to protect the town's character. And if the vote is the other way, it is what it is. And then, there's a lot of work to do, I think, after that. But I don't know. I mean, I've been working on historic preservation for almost 20 years, and, this is not a historic preservation ordinance. Historic preservation commissions oftentimes, in some developers' perspectives, are referred to as the hysterical preservation commission. I mean, and that kills me because, you know, I don't know, this country has a very odd perspective on preserving our history and our buildings. We tend to just bulldoze them over. You look at, you know, in Bangor, the old Union Station in Bangor, that's all gone. And, you know, it'd be a different place if every community preserved the buildings that make it what it is. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, Dennis McGurk, I'm a volunteer for the committee, Historic Resources Committee, and I think that Mark and Richard have kind of posed the two sides of it. In one sense, it doesn't prevent anybody from doing what they want to do. On the other hand, there is some price to be paid for it, and if we want to preserve the character, there is always a price. The question is the price too high? And we've tried very hard to make it a step in the right direction, not to have a full preservation ordinance, but to say, all right, if someone wants to consider taking something down that is important to the town, and we've defined what is, then let's talk about it, see if there aren't some alternatives, and that gives us an option and an opportunity to possibly hold it. As we have now, we've got nothing to stop that from happening. We might want to go further forward in the future with a full preservation ordinance. That's something that could be decided in the future, but this is a step in the direction of trying to maintain the character of the town at a price that I think is quite reasonable. There is no step that we can take that doesn't have a price. So I don't know how much less we can do and do anything useful.
Define price a little better. You're not just talking about the process.
There's a price in the sense that we have a 120-day period of review, and that
Time is money.
imposes something on the person who wants to destroy a building or take it down, whether or not it's for personal use or for business use. It's an imposition. Is it a terrible imposition? I don't think so. I mean, I tore down a building. If you had told me, and you were my architect, that I had to wait 120 days for it, I would have been fine with that.
Giving me more time.
That's right. And in fact, you went through it twice, and that's fine. It wasn't a historic building, fortunately, but that wouldn't have been such a price for me that I wouldn't have been willing to go forward. On the other hand, if it's somebody who just wants to come in and demolish, we can't prevent that, and we're not trying to prevent that. We're just saying, let's have a conversation, let's talk about the character of the town, let's try to make sure that we're not willy-nilly destroying things that could otherwise be saved and preserve the character of the town. And, you know, I've been through a lot in my business of the pros and cons of things, and people like to have an option that has no price. There isn't any.
I have a question. In a scenario like that, do you have standing, or do you have to, would it have to, who in the town speaks for the town? You know what I'm trying to say? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, so at that meeting,
a board member is.
so you're talking about if it comes forward, this gets passed, someone wants to demolish a building.
Yeah, who are the people who speak on the?
They submit an application to the code officer. The code officer then sends a notice to the abutters and the Historic Resources Committee, and within, 30 days, the code officer has 7 days to send that notice out, I believe, that we're going to have within 30 days, there's going to be a meeting with the Historic Resources Committee, the applicant. Likely, I would be in attendance, as would maybe the CEO, but the Historic Resources Committee would be working in that.
So, but I'm trying to get to like, you have standing, you're a town employee, so does the code officer, but do you folks?
These are
should
Historic
you-
Resources Committee,
the
right,
committee.
members that are appointed by the town,
That's in this.
and they have duties
Yeah.
in an ordinance, in our ordinance.
Right.
And one of their duties in this is to
All right,
review
so that-
demolition
okay.
permit applications.
Yep.
And that's all they are. It's
All right.
not to,
Good standing, good.
it's not to review
And
exterior changes to a building, it's not to review color, it's not to review if someone wants to swap out windows, it's not to review if someone wants to change their door or a light fixture. It's none of that. This is just to demolish the building or an addition or an L to
It cleared
that.
if I just didn't want it to look like you'd be speaking to a volunteer, and a volunteer has no more say in the community than my next door neighbor.
Volunteers like your volunteers, I would say.
Well, see,
board.
Richard, I'm on a committee and I'm on a board, all right? The committee has no real standing,
Okay,
all
that's,
right? They're advisory.
Right.
And nothing more than
Board
that.
is different.
Advisory.
Right.
If they say you can't tear your house down, you can go tomorrow and tear your house down,
or
all
120
right?
days from now.
And a board like us, we have standing.
that's what I'm getting. I was
We're just a resource.
Right. I mean,
No-
no one
no
is
authority.
telling, no one is saying that they can't demolish that building.
I know.
This is not, and that's where, again, if we go down that road, a Historic Preservation Commission, which is similar to a board, would have standing to do reviews, and you get qualified people that would be on board on that commission, including a architectural historian or someone like that is a qualified professional. That would happen under a Historic Preservation Ordinance. This is not that.
I'm comfortable now that a committee has standing by virtue of you being involved in this discussion. It's just sort of a legal thing, that's what I'm bringing up. It's like, volunteers are
And
just.
nothing they say they cannot mandate anyone to do anything that comes
Yeah, they
before
don't, they
them.
don't need standing to have a conversation.
They are just having that conversation. I mean, I've been involved in properties where neighbors didn't know that a building was going to be demolished. Once they found out it was going to be demolished, there was a group of neighbors that said, and it's not in Camden, that said, you know what? Let's buy it from that guy. And they went out and they bought it from that guy, and it got renovated. They ended up transferring it to someone else who renovated it, and now it's a beautiful historic, maintain that historic character. That happens. And that's an option in this case. In another option, they may say, can you save the main part of that building, but we don't care about the Ls because they're not significant to us?
Sure.
And that applicant may say, yeah, let me think about that. That makes sense. I mean, that's what I think, are envisioning where the committee is that there's this dialogue in good faith. And again, that applicant can come to them and pretend in good faith, yep, I'm so concerned. I totally hear you. And then wait the 120-day period and then issues a demo permit. But if that's going to happen and it is a contributing building, then we're going to get something from it, and that's that recordation that can get preserved in the.
Yeah, and that's not
Camden
the only
Public
thing
Library.
that you put in there that's mandatory, though, for the
What else you got?
demolisher. Is that, I'm going to take you on a whole run of minutia soon.
All right, go.
But to start, it's my forte. To start, I just want to go with the one that is actually substantive, and that is, I'm in the little number 3s there at the very end. Yep. And the last sentence, the owner or applicant shall also work with interested parties to salvage, recycle, and reuse as many of the building materials as possible. I think it's fine. I'm not objecting to it, but I want to make sure that that's recognized, that is a shall, which is a mandate, not may or should. So when we consider this, we should take note of that, and how that works in actuality is in practice is another question. Who's an interested party? I know the board or the committee would be interested, or a neighbor might be an interested party, or a butter.
Or Maine Preservation,
Yeah.
profit preservation organization.
And how that's enforced, or, it's just something I wanted to raise. And I don't know if we want to discuss that now, or do you want me to go through my minutia?
I'd like you to go.
We did discuss that before, and the point is, all right, if you've got architectural features in a house and you're going to tear it down, and you have to bring other people in to maybe take that out,
are encouraged, how about the owner or applicant is encouraged to work with other parties?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even this.
Oh, it's the shall part.
It's just a shall, yeah, it's just, when we say that we're only mandating that they have a conversation, in actuality, we're mandating they have a conversation, and then they record, and recordation, and then also, we're mandating that they work with someone to salvage, reuse, and recycle, and I'm not necessarily saying that's bad, I just want to make sure we recognize that that's what the language says.
I think maybe changing that shall to is encouraged.
I mean, I think, yeah, because I think most reasonable people would be like, yeah, you want to take this stuff away from me, fine, right?
There's also, when you start taking old pieces off old buildings, you've got liability issues, and you've also got things like lead paint, which is always a huge issue. I mean, just the practicalities of dealing with this kind
Yeah.
of stuff is not quite as simple as.
Understood.
Again, I think it's great when it can happen, but those would be the pieces as a homeowner, if I was having somebody coming onto my property, that I, right? And how that gets done, and who bears the liability when you've got somebody on your property ripping pieces off it.
And I think some of these things, I'm similar to where we talked about we're got down into the weeds of things that aren't really our stuff on the accessory apartments about renting and, how you're going to handle this. I mean, that's not our issue. And I'm just saying, some of this stuff, there are plenty of ordinances that do these types of things, that it's up to the applicant and the other party to figure out OSHA standards, OSHA requirements, and everything else. That is not the towns, we're not going down that road. I'm just throwing that out there.
So by the same measure, we're also looking at what the unintended consequences of these rules that we're making may be, which is why we have these discussions,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they may impact. It's not what we don't know, it's what we don't know, right? And again, I fully applaud this. I really do think it's a very good way to start moving forward.
Yeah, I think we have most of the board on.
And like the
on board with
accessory
that.
apartment, this seems like relatively safe, like the accessory apartment thing was, getting in the system and then aggrandizing it as years go on.
I will say one thing I was going to add to this, and it's not going to be in this, it's going to be into the performance standards generally section of the ordinance, is going to get at things like that we ought to have in our ordinance anyway, and this would apply to all demolitions, like dust control. Things like that are going to put into a performance standards generally section. So it would apply to the building that does eventually get demolished under this, as well as that house out on Molyneux Road, old ranch that someone wants to demolish and put in a new house. We're going to require some sort of dust control. We're going to look at the asbestos and the lead and all those other things that are out there that are concerns that need to be addressed. We're just going to put them in our ordinance, because when it comes to lead, we don't have any enforcement power over that. So if someone is demolishing a house and there's lead paint that's flying all over the neighborhood, there is little or nothing the local municipality can do. We're going to have to reach out to the state, and the state's DEP is going to say, well, really, you know what? That's really the feds' issue, because they're the ones that are supposed to handle the lead renovator rules and all those EPA requirements, is not local DEP, state DEP. So I would like to have some sort of ability for our code officer to be able to deal with lead, mercury switches, all that kind of stuff before a house gets demolished, because what ends up happening is it just never gets done right. And those switches end up in a landfill or wherever, or in a gravel pit out in Waldo County. I mean, that's the reality.
More
Just
minutia?
telling you that.
You ready for more minutia?
Yes.
Yes, more minutia, please.
So we'll go back to the very beginning now of section 2(1)A. No permit for the complete demolition in whole or in part.
Take out complete.
Yeah.
We actually had taken that.
Yeah,
But you hadn't.
yeah.
You have.
You don't like complete?
Well, it conflicts with in whole or in part.
Exactly.
Demolition is demolition. Right? So,
and
no permit for the demolition in whole or in part. When you say complete demolition in whole or in part, it starts to ring.
And I guess for me, I was trying to keep open, what I didn't want it to apply to was going down that road of a more formal historic review on treatment, like, because we would issue a demo permit. If someone's like demoing siding on a building, likely Steve's going to require a demo permit for that. So I didn't want to have to pick that up.
That's not demolition of a building, that's demolition of part of a building.
Fair.
Of like,
Okay.
of the
Sounds good.
facade or something. So I just
Go
think,
ahead.
I just
Your
think it
minutia,
reads better
keep
without
going.
it.
Can you keep going?
Yes, gladly.
I have that.
So then I tried to read, I read this whole sentence about 15 times, and it was, there was some comma issues that I had with it. So that's why we're getting into.
That's why you're here.
Yeah, now we're getting into that
Law.
minutia. So, where it fell apart for me was, getting to the part where it says, or individual properties listed on the National Historic Register. You have a comma there, and then you say, but lying outside. That comma goes away, and then it gets moved to after National Historic Districts.
I have a solution for that. I think.
Oh, gosh, I would
yeah,
love to hear it, because
yeah,
mine is just moving a comma, but.
Yeah, Jeremy and I
Backspace.
looked at this. So if you go back to historic overlays map, comma, or a building under consideration for inclusion on the National Register, comma, or an individual property listed on the National Historic Register, and then delete, but lying outside of the three named
Yep.
National Historic Districts, delete that whole phrase.
Then you wouldn't be covering.
Then just go to shall be issued until 120 days. So,
Yep.
Lying
that
outside.
works for me as well.
okay, all right, good.
And I did say there was a little bit of editing that needed to happen on this. a little bit.
And so I've got just another few. We're in under a little I or little one. The last sentence there of that section says, this section does not apply to interior demolition or demolition, comma. So I have it, the first demolition gets the comma and the second one loses the comma. This does not apply to interior demolition, comma, or demolition or removal and or replacement or repair of exterior features.
All right.
I said it was minutia, people.
I appreciate it.
Well, actually, I had suggested a change to that anyway, Jeremy, but it goes back to this, it goes up earlier than that, so. Anyway, that sentence, we had, this section does not apply to interior demolition, and then deleting, or deleting the rest of that sentence, but Jeremy and I really didn't discuss all of that.
Yeah.
Can you try making it shorter,
Yep.
the whole thing?
Yep. So if you go back to the earlier sentence, so it says, this section also applies to building additions such as Ls or wings of a building identified as architecturally significant in historic district listing, in its historic district listing. Oh, gosh, I can't
Can-
even read this.
That's
Anyway,
wordsmithing.
Yeah, and I was
Yeah,
gonna maybe,
that's
if Pat and I can, I know she gave me these comments, and Judy and Dennis gave me some comments, and I haven't been able to include them, I've just been out straight.
This section does not
I'm
apply
comfortable
to
with you guys.
interior.
You comfortable with us wordsmithing that?
A little bit more.
I mean, I think everyone
We don't need to
understands the
get into
intent. This is not applying to interior demos. This is applying to
Period.
demos of tear downs of buildings, additions, or Ls, not on trim, not on architectural features, things like that. As much as they may be super significant to that building, I just don't want to go down that road right now.
In the 120 days, we haven't spoken to where that came from. That's just kind of standard with these. Other towns have it.
Yeah,
We
other
just haven't
towns
brought
have
it
it,
up,
other
that's
towns have more.
I've seen longer.
180.
Longer.
Other towns been successful,
I'm just, yeah, that's all. I was wondering.
these sort
Well,
of
you
things?
know, they haven't made revisions, so I assume they're working, but, yeah.
I mean, generally what happens is these towns they start with a demolition review ordinance, and then eventually they transition to a historic preservation ordinance, and demolition review is part of that. That's what ends up happening.
Yeah.
That may happen in Camden, it may not happen in Camden. Again, we'll see what happens, but.
Some of them start like
Wow.
Everybody's getting contaminated. with
Okay,
it.
more minutia.
Okay.
I've got one.
Oh, you've got one? You want to interject?
Maybe it's the same one, yeah.
No, probably not if you're on that
You've got
page.
two number threes.
Oh,
two
you
little
got
eyes.
that one.
No, it's not.
Come on.
That was my next one.
I was gonna look so smart with that one. Oh,
Yeah, so it goes
Thanks.
4, 5, and 6 at the end.
All right, got that.
Something in what is now number 4.
me again.
The first sentence, it's an historical building.
We fixed that.
Yeah,
We
I'm sure you
did
guys
fix
did.
that, but see, we didn't have a chance to get the revised
Nope.
back
So
to
that's,
you.
that's on there. And then in what is now 5, it should say, once the 120-day period has been met. And then I have a comma after submitted.
Let's see.
That's more of a suggestion than.
My question is on number 4, what should be number 5 is, does the code enforcement, shall they issue the demolition permit? I just, as we were saying with shall, it's a word that kind
We were
of
just going to go may.
feet in concrete.
I was going to say may.
Yep.
Right.
I mean, I think may is fine.
I like
mean,
may.
the reality is, and I think that's what these folks liked. The reality is we have to. The code officer has
At that point, you have
has
to.
to act,
May covers it.
but may covers it,
May
and it doesn't. It doesn't say
If
it's.
we write that they have to issue the permit, then it's like,
And that's the end of my minutia.
But he does.
We suggested
so we don't need to write it.
We suggested May.
He doesn't have to issue it, he could deny it
An officer to have some
if there was some reason.
to say,
So-
all right, if you acted in
Question
good
it
faith
more.
in this whole process, then fine. But if you haven't, you just waited it out, well, maybe not.
The taxes haven't been paid. Something like
That's
that. There
a
might be a
good point.
reason to.
We shall. The code officer may not be able to issue a permit if taxes aren't paid or other issues. We're not going to issue that demo permit. So may is probably a better word.
It's a little safer.
Could I just maybe get a, everyone, not everyone, but generally okay with this? Maybe? 4-1?
I mean, if this is what you want to present, sure, but I don't ever see it being voted for.
And maybe it takes, a lot of education. People get out there, get the word out that this is important to Camden, and, I mean, we'll see what happens.
Just what do you think people's main issues are going to be with it?
Well, I mean, all it does is delay it 120 days. There's no teeth in it, and it doesn't really resolve any of the issues we're trying to resolve here. It just stretches it
may.
out 120 days.
I'm looking at the bright side of things. My glass is half
If
full.
it passes and it saves one building out of 12 that come up for demo,
Yeah.
it's done something.
Sure.
And that's the way,
My point is, why not do it right the first time?
Well, right may not pass.
Yeah.
Right takes away, puts a whole bunch of, as Jeremy explained last time, puts a whole bunch of new stuff on our plate as far as what you can and can't do, how you do it, and all that stuff, and we cede a lot of
So-
local control.
So let me ask you a question. If you've got a building in a historic resource,
New district.
In a
Yeah.
historical
All right.
relay.
and it's falling down, it's in complete disrepair, you want to tear it down. It's got no value, it's got no historic value. You have to wait 120 days to tear that down.
No historic value, then it's a non-contributing
The
building.
code officer,
It still has to go through this process.
It has to go through.
Non-contributing building?
Yeah.
If it's of no value with, when it comes to the Historic Resources Committee and that thing is falling in, I mean, we're going to say to the code enforcement officer,
and maybe I need to, I can come up with some language. Following, something about following that initial meeting, if it is determined at that review meeting that this building,
It's beyond salvage or whatever.
or for whatever, the permit may be issued by the code
Right, so
officer.
take the 120 days off.
Right.
that was,
for that meeting.
I guess it didn't really come through.
It seems reasonable. Does that address somewhat your concern, Mark?
That should be at the
Yeah,
volition of the code
but-
enforcement officer, not not for the applicant, right?
What's that?
The code enforcement officer should be able to say, all right, we've had our discussion, the Historic Resources Committee says there's no value in this, and it's fine if it comes down, then the code enforcement officer or the planning officer gets to decide to waive the 120 days. It's not an automatic.
Yeah, I'm going to have to wordsmith something on that. I know that the waiting period does not apply, would not apply if the building's ordered to be demolished by the code officer or the fire chief. That's in there.
Or his life
And maybe I can tweak that or work some of the other sections to get at this point. I understand where you're coming from, and
Isn't it covered under number 5 on the last page?
no.
What if the waiting, what if the waiting
Or
period?
I think I can change that to say the waiting period shall not apply to those applications that have been reviewed by the Historic Resource Committee, but it's been deemed that it is, the 120-day period can be waived.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I'll
Recommended,
Because
maybe.
if you.
I'll
if
do
the
that
committee
in that
can-
last section.
If the committee can shorten that 120 days by just a vote, that
They
would be
could
great.
recommend that it be
And say, oh, this
waived.
building, you know, this little shed in the back.
You see, that's my point, right? They're a committee, they're not a board.
Well, they have a little bit of teeth. We've already been over
They,
this.
you're giving the authority to the code enforcement officer that he cannot issue this demolition permit for 120 days.
Yep.
Okay? So a committee cannot tell,
I will chat with,
recommend it.
Bill Kelly is in the office, town attorney's in the office with me tomorrow. I will have this conversation with him. Okay?
It just costs us another $200.
Yeah.
Understood.
You know, this sort of thing, lots of words involved, and yet at the same time, I grieve when I see houses in town that have true historic significance, which are undergoing renovations now, which will alter them forever. So I wish that the sort of effort that went into preparing this would be directed to protecting places like I'm referring to.
We welcome your help on that.
Well, I'm doing all my help right here.
He's vacating this board soon, so give him an application for your committee.
It's interesting, Richard. I hear you, and I've had some people have said, can you put some standards in for the planning board to review, some of this kind of stuff, and I get that, but if you look at the, where site plan is required in the one section, site plan review is required on changes to architectural features or exterior features like windows or trim. If you do 2 of 5 within a certain amount of period in certain zones, you got to go to the planning board for a review. That is 100% voluntary. So they go to the planning
ones I'm
board.
referring to wouldn't even have to come to the planning board. All they do is pull a permit.
I understand,
Alpha
but
vinyl?
it's just kind of, to me, it's kind of this, I mean, we already,
It's a feel good.
it's a feel-good thing. It doesn't, and they come in here and they say, yeah, I understand. Yep.
thanks
Yep.
for your input.
Thanks, see ya.
We had one application to take down one of the older houses in town, and the guy, we just made a request of him, would he be willing to talk to members of the Historic Preservation Committee? And we put the offer out to them, and I don't think anybody ever came forward. It's not a significant
It wasn't a
house, but
significant building.
It was old.
Well, we're reaching out, when people do come in, we're trying to educate, the town's concerned about our character. We want to preserve as much as possible. We don't have anything that mandates you to do it, but can you meet with a committee? Can you think about other options? We do say that. I mean,
Well,
may not
thank
get
you
anywhere.
Thank you.
This
for
guy
your
was very
comments,
nice.
Richard, because I totally agree with you that
What?
some of the historic updating
Yeah.
just ruins
And
so-called
even though this isn't a
updating.
historic structure, I'm really pleased to see what's happening at McDuck's.
Yes.
That's a nice-looking little building coming on there. Don't you know that one?
What is that?
At the Five Corners, what was it?
Station,
Subway?
For McDuck's.
corner, top of the hill's been derelict,
Sale.
ugly building for years.
Subway.
New owner, new building.
Beautiful building that's there for a long
Hate to see those.
Historic in 100 years.
It is historic now.
Thank you.
It's one
I
of the
just-
few canopies
I
left.
just want to say thank you for all your work that you're doing on this. It's, yeah, I do appreciate it.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Pat. I'll
Yeah.
work with you and the next, get those going. Okay. All right. I think this
What,
next
can we go
one,
home now? No.
I thought we tabled this next
So
one.
it's 7 o'clock. Can we go home now?
this quick. This will be an easy one. I tried to make it as easy as possible for you. I did a little memo. Do you have a copy of that memo? I sent it to everyone. To print it, okay. well,
Amendments to zoning ordinance.
Guys don't look at your emails, so that's all right.
Look,
Through
yeah,
my
I just don't
emails.
print it.
So, what I was trying to get at in this memo, Jeannie did a good job on identifying all of the areas in the zoning ordinance where BTR is. And so I'll go quickly through my memo that you have. You may not have it with you, but the little memo just addresses each spot in the zoning ordinance where BTR is and what's going to happen when it goes away. So the first one, would be in Article 3 definitions, residential use. When you delete BTR, there is no impact and no change because B1 is already included in that. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Everyone get that?
Would I maybe be able to help shorten this up?
Sure.
And just by
Absolutely.
saying what we're doing here is just eliminating BTR and turning it into B1.
Yep.
And Jeannie has taken care of all the appropriate.
Yep. And there's no negative changes, no impacts on property owners, really, at all. There
There's
was
only
one
one
section, there was one section on nonconformities, that doesn't apply because there are no nonconforming uses in the BTR, so that doesn't matter. And then there was one other section, the BAS, right? The BAS does not apply in the B1, but it applies in the BTR. But the BAS only applies to lots of an acre or more.
Bars?
The business opportunity zone, it's this odd overlay zone that you guys did a little while ago. No one has taken advantage of it, I can tell. There's one property, so what I did was I said the BAS applies in the B1 on lots over an acre, because there's only, I don't have the list right in front of me, but there are like 5 lots in the B1 that are,
One in the B1, 5 in the BTR.
right, and the 5 in the BTR are mostly town-owned properties, and the one that is not, that becomes B1, or that is in B1 that would be impacted by this would be the Camden parking lot. And I don't see that as a negative at all. That's the one lot in the B1 that's over an acre currently.
So in that last paragraph, or BTR.
Which last paragraph, Mark?
Third,
Which,
paragraph 7.
site plan review, that
Site
one?
plan review.
Okay.
Site plan review.
Yep.
Design standards for new construction or BTR, excuse me, or BTR, should that be crossed out? Is that what that?
Where's this one?
Right here, Jeannie, on the last page, the BTR, it's not crossed out.
Oh, it's red.
Yeah,
It's
that should be a
underlined.
strike through. Correct.
Thank you.
And Jeannie, just is really, really picky, but there's a couple of spots in there where it says 6/10/2020, and you've got a comma instead of a dash or a slash.
Oh, okay, all right.
I've got it in,
Yeah,
under,
I see it.
under number 5, I've got it in 3rd and 4th,
In number 1,
Number
definitions.
5.
and also
Okay, I see
one
that.
other one.
Definitions,
3 in a row
residential.
there.
Fourth.
The second, the third, and the fourth.
Right.
I see it there.
Yep, that's right, that's where it was, in the second as well. Yep.
That's what this ordinance does.
Also on minutia, because I'm sitting next to this guy.
Uh-huh.
What's a scrivener's error?
Scrivener's error means that it wasn't intentional. It was just written incorrectly, I think.
And that's
It's
actually.
obvious that they have the the right words, they just don't have the right abbreviation.
Right.
It's,
And you wrote this, it wasn't in the
I
ordinance?
highlighted.
Oh, okay,
yeah,
all right.
that it's not going to say BTR. It's going to, what comes out.
And remember, just for the record, I sent a letter to all of the property owners impacted by this, and I have heard from no one.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move forward with getting this to a public hearing for the next time around, okay? As soon as possible.
Make a motion on that?
Yes, please.
I make a motion, we move this forward,
Public hearing.
public hearing?
All those in favour? Aye, 5-0.
Great, thank you. One item for, before we get out of here, item for next February 6th meeting. What you have right here are packets for you guys to take. I know you love paper. This is the middle school parking lot MET project. I have reached out, and remember, site walks are not required for site plans. Remember, they're just required for subdivisions. But would you like to have a site walk for this one?
Yes.
What our plan is, and I reached out to the engineer today. I haven't heard back from him yet, but I asked him if he could do a site walk at 4 o'clock before our 5 o'clock meeting.
There'll be enough light at that point, I'm guessing.
Oh, we didn't just see anything.
And then, a couple more weeks, light at 5.
That's a change.
Is that our next meeting?
February 6th. Yep.
Yeah, so we do the site walk and then come and
And come
have
here
our
and do
regular
that.
meeting.
And I'm going to do a completeness review and all that stuff. I'm going to make sure all the standards are met, so then you guys can just focus on your review criteria only, and hopefully we can do this in one night. That's my hope.
Right.
Sound
You need a
good?
motion on the sidewalk.
Want a motion on sidewalk?
Usually you would during a regular site plan review, if you agreed to have a sidewalk, you'd move to hold it on a certain,
So I make a motion to move that we hold a site walk for the CRMS amendment to the site plan at 4 PM on February the 6th.
perfect.
Do I have a second?
Second?
All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye, 5-0.
Great. And we can just get an update on February 20th or 27th from people?
I'm
Because
not
school
traveling.
vacation is
Yeah,
February
I'm not
20th.
traveling.
You're away, aren't you, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm going to miss the 20th.
All right. 27th work for everyone?
So are you saying that if we won't hold the 20th and have it on the 27th
That's my thought.
instead? Is that
If
your
you're for,
thinking?
a tie would lose the application,
We
so
always agree with each other.
Talking about moving it from,
27th?
20th to the 27th.
yeah, I won't be here the 27th.
no mind.
To be here.
Okay. Maybe what likely will happen is we'll likely have a hearing probably on zoning ordinance amendments for on the 20th.
So we're going to stick with the 20th
Let's plan on
I'll
that.
be here the 20th.
Let's plan on that.
and not the
Maybe we'll do certain
27th.
hearings on the 20th and certain other hearings on the 27th.
You're saying we're doing both weeks? No. One or the other. You get us twice a month and that's that. Okay, so we're saying we're going to stick with February the 20th then?
Yes, for that,
Okay.
yes. I think that makes sense.
And the school, if it continues and doesn't finish on the 6th, will have to wait till March.
Okay, and in which case that would move to March the 5th.
Is that what you're saying?
Is that-
Just do zoning amendments, or
On the 20th?
I'm asking?
I mean, I think we ought to be, if we don't do if we can't get through on the February 6th, the middle school site plan, then I think we just continue to the 20th, and Jeff's just not here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what you get for taking vacation.
I get the feeling we won't. I mean, if they're the only applicant in that night,
There's a public hearing on the,
Accessory apartments,
Zoning.
hopefully.
well, we never know how long that's going to take, do we?
I mean, I think we just gotta,
I think we're pretty clear on what's going on there now.
yeah, I think so too.
I don't-
I think so too. And I think the board has heard a lot of,
you can
Information.
wait till the 20th to hold that hearing.
and maybe we'll do that. I'll work with Jeannie tomorrow on the scheduling that. But I would like to get through some of these site plans, I don't think we need to do multiple meetings on some of these, especially if we do a site walk before.
So what if we do MET first in that night and then do the ordinance after?
I'm down with that.
right? So then we could push the ordinance to the 20th.
Depends on how many people from the public are here, I guess. We usually try to accommodate the public and hold these first. That's been the past practice.
I think it depends on who shows up. I mean, I would have moved the historic the demolition piece.
for
I would have moved the
accessory
demolition piece
apartments?
further ahead had they been here, you know, at the beginning of the meeting. I would have just done that. So. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Tell me what the decision is.
What decision? We're going to start, we're going to, the school?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ordinances on it.
You and I are going to talk tomorrow to see if we can
Okay.
finagle ordinances for the 6th.
Yes, so can I make a motion to close the meeting?
You sure can.
Seconded?
Seconded.
All those in favour? All right, yes, meeting closed, thank you.